All right, let's go. Number 10. In 3000 BCE, the pharaohs of the first and second dynasties were sealing their tombs and raising their first monuments to the sky. But the wood they used to do it did not come from Egypt. Cedar beams, found inside the substructure of early royal tombs at Abydos and Saqqara, have been traced by their resin and grain to a single mountain range 600 miles away, the slopes of Lebanon. Egyptian texts from the Palermo stone record ships called Byblos boats, named for the Levantine port they sailed to, again and again, for timber Egypt simply did not have. Here is the scale of it. This wasn't a rumor of contact, it was an economy. Fleets crossed open Mediterranean water at a time when most of humanity hadn't figured out how to sail out of sight of land. The Egyptians weren't hugging the coast, they were crossing it, on purpose, on a schedule, for a resource they needed to bury their kings. An entire foreign supply chain, propping up the afterlife of a civilization we think of as sealed inside its own river valley. But here's where the story stops being simple trade. Some of the cedar recovered from beneath the Step Pyramid complex shows tool marks that don't match Egyptian carpentry at all, cut patterns closer to Levantine coastal workshops. Which means, at times, the wood arrived already worked, already shaped by hands that were never Egyptian, inside monuments that were supposed to be a sealed, self-contained expression of one culture's power over death. What's left now is quiet. The Byblos boats are gone, dissolved centuries ago into the sediment of harbors nobody has fully excavated. The cedar itself, thousands of years old, still lies in the dark under the sand, holding the shape of a forest that no longer exists, in a country most of the pharaohs who used it never once set foot in. Number 9. Around 2600 BCE, along the coast of what is now Pakistan and western India, the cities of the Indus Valley civilization were laying out streets on a grid, running covered drainage beneath their houses, and stamping small soapstone seals with animals and symbols nobody has ever translated. And halfway across the ancient world, in the city-states of Sumer, those exact seals started turning up. In Ur, in Kish, buried in the accounts of merchants who called this distant place Meluha. The scale of what this means is staggering. This was not an accidental drift of one boat blown off course. Sumerian cuneiform tablets record shipments of carnelian beads, ivory, and hardwoods explicitly from Meluha, alongside complaints about delayed cargo and disputes over payment. The bureaucratic residue of a functioning trade route 4,500 years ago, spanning over 1,000 miles of open water and coastline, connecting two of the very first urban civilizations on Earth before either language had even settled into a form we can fully read. But here is where the silence turns unsettling. The Indus script on those seals has never been deciphered. Not once in nearly 2 centuries of trying. We know these people traded with Sumer. We know their cities had sanitation systems more advanced than European cities 3,000 years later. We know almost nothing about what they believed, who ruled them, or why around 1900 BCE their cities were abandoned. Not burned, not conquered as far as anyone can prove, just quietly emptied. Today the seals sit in museum drawers, carved with a language that still refuses to speak. Sumer's writing survived. Meluha's did not. Somewhere in that asymmetry is an entire worldview that connected two ends of the ancient world and then disappeared into a silence 4,000 years deep. Number 8. By 1500 BCE, deep inside the shaft graves of Mycenaean, Greek nobles were being buried with gold masks, bronze swords, and strings of amber beads. Chemical analysis of that amber, using infrared spectroscopy that can fingerprint fossilized resin by its molecular signature, has traced it not to anywhere in the Mediterranean, but to the Baltic coast, over 1,000 miles north, through Central Europe, through lands with no writing, no cities, and no political structure we can name. Think about the scale of that supply chain. There was no Baltic Empire moving this material. No single culture controlled the route from the Baltic Sea to the Peloponnese. Instead, archaeologists believe amber passed hand to hand, village to village, river to river, across dozens of unrelated tribal groups who left almost no written trace of themselves, each one trusting the next enough to keep valuable cargo moving forward instead of simply keeping it. But here is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. This route, later called the Amber Road, predates any unifying culture, empire, or shared religion across that entire stretch of Europe. Which means, before recorded history in most of that region even begins, there was already a functioning international economy. Invisible to us because none of its participants left behind a name, a king, or a single sentence explaining who they were. The amber still exists. It sits in Greek museum cases now, warm-colored and fossilized, 35 million years older than the hands that buried it. The route that carried it, and every person who walked it, left nothing behind except the object itself. Proof of a network with no author. Number 7. In 1846, inside the vast prehistoric salt mine at Hallstatt in the Austrian Alps, miners preserving ancient timber supports and tools began pulling fragments of textile out of the salt-saturated ground. Modern fiber analysis, decades later, confirms something nobody expected. Silk. Genuine silk fiber, dated to roughly 600 BCE, 3 centuries before Alexander the Great's conquests supposedly cracked open the first real contact between Europe and Asia. The scale of the anachronism is difficult to overstate. Silk production, at this point in history, was a fiercely guarded Chinese state secret. The techniques of raising silkworms and processing their cocoons were, according to later Roman writers, punishable by death to reveal. And yet here it is, woven into the clothing of Iron Age salt miners in the mountains of Austria, centuries before any recorded diplomatic or military contact existed between the two ends of Eurasia. But here's where the timeline breaks down entirely.
Trace element analysis on the fibers points to an origin in China, but no one can say with confidence which hands carried it those 7,000 kilometers, through how many intermediary cultures, or why something so restricted and valuable ended up wrapped around the bodies of salt workers instead of nobility. It suggests trade networks running silently across the entire Eurasian landmass, centuries before any civilization thought to write them down. The fragments are preserved now behind glass in Austrian museums, kept intact by the same salt that once meant a mine worker's daily labor. A secret China tried to protect with execution somehow crossed the known world in silence, and nobody left a single record of the journey. Number 6. By the 1st century CE, Roman writers were describing a distant eastern people they called the Ceres, the Silk People, a nation so far east that Pliny the Elder complained bitterly about the fortune Rome was bleeding out to buy their fabric. Excavations at Pompeii, frozen in ash in 79 CE, have recovered fragments of silk textile in wealthy villas, physical proof that Chinese silk was reaching the height of the Roman elite, 7,000 kilometers from its source, before the city itself was buried alive. The scale of this contact is almost absurd when you say it out loud. 2 of the largest empires in human history, Rome and Han China, never fought a war, never signed a treaty, and likely never sent a single verified official ambassador to each other's capital. And yet, their economies were entangled. Roman senators debated banning silk to stop the drain of gold eastward. Chinese court records describe rumors of a wealthy western land called Daqin.
Each empire knew the other existed almost entirely through the objects passing between them. But here's where it turns genuinely strange. The Romans never developed an accurate picture of what China actually was. No reliable maps, no real accounts of its cities or rulers, just a hazy, half-mythical land at the edge of the world, known through silk and rumor alone. 2 civilizations, each capable of building roads across continents and armies that conquered kingdoms, were connected by a supply chain neither one fully understood the other end of. The silk from Pompeii is still there today, carbonized by the same eruption that killed the people wearing it, a fragment of a nation the Romans never truly saw, wrapped around bodies that never once considered how far it had traveled to reach them. Number 5. Around 600 BCE, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II commissioned a fleet of Phoenician sailors to do something almost nobody in the ancient world had attempted: circumnavigate the entire continent of Africa. Herodotus records that the voyage took over 2 years, that the sailors put ashore twice a year to plant and harvest grain before continuing, and that they returned through the Pillars of Hercules, having sailed the whole way around. Here is the detail that makes historians take it seriously instead of dismissing it as myth. Herodotus himself found one part of the account impossible to believe. The sailors reported that at one point during the voyage, the sun appeared on their right hand,
to the north instead of the south. Herodotus recorded this as an error. But if the fleet truly rounded the southern tip of Africa, that is exactly what the sun would do from that latitude. A detail so specific, so counterintuitive, and so accurate that a storyteller inventing the voyage would have had no reason to include it. But here's where the story turns unsettling. If true, this means Phoenician sailors achieved something Europeans would not repeat for over 2,000 years, using ships and instruments we can barely reconstruct, in complete silence, with no surviving logs, no named captain, and no follow-up expedition that history remembers. An achievement that should have rewritten the ancient world's understanding of the planet's shape simply vanished back into rumor. No wreck has ever been found. No Phoenician account of the voyage survives in their own words. All that's left is a skeptical footnote from a Greek historian, describing a detail so accurate it shouldn't have been possible to invent. Proof, perhaps, of the single greatest maritime achievement of the ancient world, remembered only because someone doubted it. Number 4. In 1960, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Norwegian explorers Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad began excavating a set of grass-covered mounds at a site called Meadows. What they uncovered was unmistakable. Sod-walled Norse buildings, an iron smithy, a bronze ring pin, and radiocarbon dates confirming Viking presence in North America around 1000 CE, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. It remains, to this day, the only site on the entire continent where pre-Columbian European contact has been physically proven beyond doubt. The scale of what this confirms is enormous. The Icelandic sagas describe Leif Erikson sailing west from Greenland to a land he called Vinland, rich with wild grapes and timber. For centuries, this was treated as legend. Meadows turned legend into fact, hard evidence that Norse sailors reached, camped on, and worked iron on North American soil 500 years before anyone in Western Europe believed the Americas existed at all.
But here's where it becomes disturbing rather than triumphant. The site shows signs of only brief, repeated occupation, a base camp, not a colony. The Norse came, worked, and then simply stopped coming. No lasting settlement, no follow-through. An entire continent reached and then abandoned, its opportunity discarded by the very people who found it first, for reasons the sagas hint at through conflict with indigenous peoples they called the Skryling, but never fully explain. The site is a quiet field of grass-covered mounds today, rebuilt with reconstructed sod houses for tourists to walk through. Beneath the reconstruction, the real foundations remain, proof that the New World was found once already, and then, for 500 years, deliberately forgotten.
Number 3. In modern Polynesia, geneticists studying the DNA of populations on Rapa Nui, French Polynesia, and other Pacific islands have identified segments matching indigenous South American ancestry, dated by genetic recombination clock analysis to roughly 1200 CE, centuries before European ships ever entered the Pacific. The physical evidence backs it up. The sweet potato, a crop native exclusively to the Americas, was already established and being cultivated across the Pacific Islands long before Columbus, under Polynesian names that trace linguistically back to South American Quechua words for the same plant. The scale of this contact is almost impossible to comprehend by the standards of the time. This means Polynesian voyagers, using double-hulled canoes and navigation based on stars, swells, and bird flight, crossed thousands of miles of the most open, dangerous ocean on the planet, made contact with South America, and carried a living crop back across that same distance, accomplishing, without instruments, what Europe would not manage until it had the compass, the sextant, and centuries more experience at sea. But here's where the mystery deepens instead of resolving. Nobody knows for certain whether Polynesians sailed east to South America, whether South Americans sailed west into the Pacific, or both. The genetic and linguistic evidence is unambiguous. The direction and the story behind it is not. It means one of the greatest maritime achievements in human history has no named voyager, no surviving account, no memory of the crossing at all, only its genetic fingerprint,
still carried today in the blood of people who have no oral memory of how it got there. The sweet potato still grows across the Pacific, an edible fossil of a crossing nobody wrote down. The DNA still sits quietly in the genome of living islanders, proof of a voyage whose captain, ship, and reason for sailing have been erased completely from human memory.
Number 2. In 2020, a genetic study published in the journal Nature confirmed something researchers had suspected for decades, but could never prove. Populations along the coast of pre-Columbian Chile carry genetic markers tracing back to Pacific Islanders, evidence of direct human contact between Polynesia and South America centuries before any European vessel reached the western coast of the continent. The scale of what this confirms rewrites the assumed map of the ancient world. It means the Pacific Ocean, the largest and most isolating body of water on the planet, covering a third of Earth's surface, was not a barrier separating two unconnected human stories, but a corridor. Polynesian navigators reached a continent, left genetic evidence still detectable in living populations 500 years later, and this happened in complete silence, with zero written record on either side of the exchange. But here is where the discovery turns genuinely unsettling. This is not oral tradition. This is not a disputed artifact or a single ambiguous carbon date. This is hard genetic data, peer-reviewed, published in one of the most rigorous scientific journals on Earth, confirming a transoceanic human crossing that the historical record simply never mentioned at all. An entire chapter of human contact, real and provable, that no civilization involved thought worth writing down, or that was written down in a way we have since completely lost. The DNA is inside living people today, in Chile, carrying the proof of an ocean crossing their own ancestors apparently never spoke of. Science had to reach into the human genome itself to recover a voyage that history simply let go.
Number 1. Deep in the Great Sand Sea of the Sahara, along the border of Egypt and Libya, lies a stretch of desert scattered with fragments of natural glass so pure it looks manufactured. Bedouin traders had collected it for centuries. In 1932, English explorer Patrick Clayton formally documented it for Western science. Decades later, one particular yellow-green fragment of this material was found carved into a scarab, set at the center of the burial breastplate of Tutankhamun himself, sealed inside his tomb for over 3,000 years. Here is the scale of what created it. Libyan desert glass is not volcanic. It is not man-made. Isotopic and chemical analysis has confirmed it formed roughly 28.5 million years ago in a single instant, when temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to instantly liquefy sand into glass across a massive stretch of desert, were generated by either a cosmic airburst or a direct meteorite impact so violent it left no confirmed crater to this day. But here's where the horror sets in. Egyptian artisans over 3,000 years ago somehow acquired a fragment of glass created by a catastrophic celestial event that happened 28 million years before their civilization even existed, carried it hundreds of miles from the deep desert, and placed it directly over the heart of their god king, without any concept of asteroids, impact physics, or deep geological time. They held a piece of a sky-born cataclysm in their hands and simply called it beautiful. The scarab still sits in Cairo today, gold and lapis surrounding a sliver of glass older than the pyramids, older than humanity itself, older than most of the mammals that would eventually evolve into us. A fragment of the sky that fell to earth in fire, waited 28 million years in the sand, and ended up resting, of all places, on the chest of a boy king, sealed in the dark, in a tomb we only found by accident. 10 discoveries, 10 silences, and underneath all of them, the same uncomfortable truth. The version of ancient history taught in classrooms, isolated continents, sealed civilizations, humanity slowly and independently discovering itself in separate corners of the planet, was never quite accurate. Long before satellites, before compasses, before written maps, human beings were already crossing oceans, deserts, and mountain ranges that modern history insists they shouldn't have been able to cross at all. Cedar moved from Lebanon to Egypt. Amber moved from the Baltic to Mycenae. Silk moved from China to a salt mine in the Alps and a villa in Pompeii. DNA moved across the widest ocean on Earth and is still sitting, quietly, in the blood of people alive today who have never heard the story of how it got there. And a fragment of the sky itself, born in fire 28 million years before Egypt existed, ended up resting on the chest of a king who thought it was simply beautiful. Every civilization we study likes to believe it was self-contained, self-made, isolated behind its own borders and its own myths. The evidence keeps saying otherwise. Somewhere out past the edge of every map we've ever trusted, contact was already happening, and the silence left behind isn't proof that it didn't. It's proof of how much we've already forgotten. Think about that the next time someone tells you the ancient world was small. It wasn't small. It was silent. The ships sailed. The trade routes ran. The genes crossed the widest ocean on the planet. Nobody today can name the sailors, the merchants, or the reasons half of them made the crossing at all. History remembers empires because empires wrote things down. It forgets the quiet networks underneath them, the ones that actually moved the world. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.